want to welcome you to another video Drasha. This week's portion is Vayikra. And with this portion we are beginning the third book of the Torah, which in Hebrew we call Vayikra, which is simply the first word of the portion. The portion begins, and of course this book begins with the word Vayikra, and it means he called, because the portion begins and the Lord called to Moses. In English, we call this book Leviticus, which tells us something about the subject matter. Indeed, the word Leviticus, which comes from Latin, and you can see in it the word Levite. Leviticus has the word Levite in it, because this book, and particularly the first several Torah portions, deal in great detail with the rituals, particularly the sacrifices that were brought to the temple in Jerusalem and which were there offered by the Levites, but particularly by the subgroup of the Levites who are the Kohanim, the priests. And so that's why the name Leviticus is based on the subject matter of much of this book. But this book and this Torah portion brings us to the vexing question of the sacrifices. And what was the point of sacrificing animals? And how was that indeed a religious act? Now, we should note that there are a number of different types of sacrifices and offerings that are dealt with in this Torah portion. First of all, there are communal offerings and there are individual offerings. Among the communal offerings, there were daily offerings and there were special offerings for the Shabbos and for the festivals. The individual offerings, there were both free will or voluntary offerings, and there were obligatory sacrifices. For instance, the chatat, the sin offering, which a person had to bring as part of the process of atonement for committing an inadvertent transgression. And certainly these sacrifices were very much a central aspect, I think we can even say the central aspect of biblical religion. As long as the temple stood in Jerusalem, these animal sacrifices were really a central aspect of religion. And so this is a question. It is very difficult for us to conceive, to get our heads around how bringing animals to the temple to be slaughtered was a religious ritual and something that somehow brought us closer to God. I think one of the reasons why this is so difficult for us is we haven't seen any sacrifices for more than 2,000 years. When the temple was destroyed in the year 70 CE, that was the end of the sacrificial system. And therefore Judaism has existed, and of course institutions like the synagogue and public worship and study have taken the place of the sacrifices, and hence it's gotten to a point where we have a hard time imagining what was this all about. What did people really feel when they saw these rituals in the temple in Jerusalem? One of the significant figures from the Middle Ages, the Rambam, Maimonides, actually suggested something that is kind of a radical approach, certainly one that's not generally accepted. But in the Moreh Nevuchim, in the Guide for the Perplexed, which was Maimonides' great philosophical work, the work in which he did attempt to provide explanations for things in the Torah that were difficult to understand from a rational point of view. So he explains in there things like miracles, prophecy, and he has a section on the sacrifices. And Maimonides says that the sacrifices were included in the Torah really as a compromise, that God does not need nor does he want sacrifices. So why are they included in the Torah? Because in ancient religions, in all ancient religions, animal sacrifices were a central feature of religion, and that the people of Israel would not have been able to accept a religion without animal sacrifices. And let's remember that they were already being asked to participate in a religion that made very great demands on them in terms of the innovations that were put forward by Judaism. First of all, of course, was monotheism. After all other religions had multiple gods who were responsible for and connected with various aspects of nature and life. Judaism says, no, there's only one God who created everything and who runs the world. Also, Judaism said God has no physical form, no shape, nothing that you can see. God is invisible. All other ancient religions had idols, statues, images of the gods that you could see, you could look at them while you were worshiping. Judaism said, no, our God has no physical form, is completely invisible. Also, Judaism said our God requires ethical behavior and moral behavior. And so to be a faithful Israelite, one has to care for the poor, the widow, the stranger, the orphan. And so this religion was already very demanding and was very unlike the other religions that existed in the ancient world. And we see how difficult it was by simply reading the Bible, by reading particularly the books of the prophets, in which we find over and over and over again the prophets haranguing the people for worshiping idols, for worshiping other gods, and for engaging in ethical and moral behavior that was not up to the standards that the God of Israel demanded. So we see this was not a religion that was easily implemented. It was not a religion that was easily adopted as the national religion of the Israelites. It took centuries. And again, when we read the books of the prophets, we see how easily people slid backwards into the ideas and the norms of the other religions which surrounded them. And so apparently, according to Maimonides at least, the Torah said on the issue of sacrifice, there'll be a compromise. To have a religion in which people are not going to offer sacrifices would have been inconceivable to the people at that time. And so the Torah then simply put limitations on it. There are only certain animals that will be sacrificed, only in one place, only in the temple in Jerusalem, and only by one group of people, the Kohanim, the priests who officiated at the sacrifices. And so the Torah then made this compromise, and that is why we find the sacrifices described in the Torah. But one shouldn't think, according to Maimonides, that God really wants sacrifices. Now, this position of Maimonides, of the Rambam, was not generally accepted, and other philosophers of the Middle Ages argued with him. Indeed, perhaps the most famous, and after the Rambam, perhaps the most famous Jewish philosopher of the Middle Ages was the Ramban. One has to be careful not to confuse these two acronyms, right? Maimonides, who is the Rambam, and Nachmanides, who was the Ramban with an N at the end. The Ramban lived about 100 years after Maimonides. So first of all, he was already familiar with the writings of Maimonides, and in many cases he argues with Maimonides, as he does indeed concerning his view of the sacrifices. The Ramban points out that there are other places in Torah where sacrifices are brought, where clearly God seems to be very happy about it, very satisfied. When Noah gets off the ark, the first thing he does is to offer up sacrifices, and the Torah there says that it was a sweet odor to the Lord. So the Ramban says that it's not correct to say that these sacrifices were only a compromise. The other thing that we need to note is that the sacrifices in the temple were not exactly a sideshow. This was the main event. Okay, biblical religion, until the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, biblical religion was primarily a matter of the rituals that went on in the temple in Jerusalem. And of course, we see that in this book of Leviticus, where there is a great deal of attention paid to all of these sacrifices. And very importantly, the sacrifices were part of the system of how one gained atonement. So that when you committed a sin inadvertently, part of gaining atonement for that was you needed to bring a sacrifice to the temple in Jerusalem. Now again, it's very hard for us to understand how this worked, but I would suggest a couple of things, particularly when it comes to the sin offerings. We can say that in an agricultural society, after all, bringing a sheep or a goat because you inadvertently committed a transgression meant that you were paying a financial cost. This was a financial sacrifice as well. If you had to take one of the animals from your flock and kill it. But also, I think there is a concept here of what we could call vicarious suffering, and that is the person who brought the animal to be killed somehow recognized that really they were the ones who should be offered up. They were the ones, after all, who committed the offense, and that the animal is being offered up in place of the person. When it comes to the communal offerings and the voluntary offerings, there, again, it's much more difficult. And I have to admit, it's very hard for me to come up with a rational explanation for how these sacrifices made people feel closer to God. And yet, we should recognize that the word for sacrifice in Hebrew is korban. Korban comes from the root in Hebrew that means to be close. It seems that indeed this was the purpose of the sacrifices. It was a way of allowing people to become closer to God. The other thing is, one can imagine that the sight in the temple, with all of the throngs of people there, and with the Levites singing, and with all of this activity going on, it must have been, I think, a very impressive sight as well. And we're coming up to Passover, and what was the primary activity on Passover? It was to bring the Korban Pesach, the Passover offering. That's why we have the shank bone on the Seder plate as a remembrance of the Korban Pesach. And indeed, every family before Passover was supposed to acquire a sheep, and then they had to come to Jerusalem and to have the sheep sacrificed by the Kohanim, by the priests in the temple, and then the meat of that Korban Pesach, of that sacrifice, was brought to the Seder where it was eaten. So we see again how central this sacrificial system was to the observance of Judaism in biblical times. And yet I'll also say, when we look at the Bible, particularly at various portions of the prophetic books, we see that even during biblical times, there was a certain questioning of the sacrificial system. There are many places in the prophets, but I'll quote just one here. The prophet Hosea, who lived in the 8th pre-Christian century. The prophet Hosea says, speaking for God, I desire kindness, not sacrifices. I desire obedience to God, not burnt offerings. So we see that already among the prophets in biblical times, there was a certain sense that questioned perhaps the validity of the sacrifices. Although I do think that even for someone like Hosea, he would not have argued that the sacrificial system should be brought to an end. Rather, what he was arguing is it has to be part of a larger religious framework, which really includes our ethical and moral behavior. What the prophet said over and over and over again is you can't mistreat the poor and the widow and the stranger and then bring a sacrifice to the temple and think that somehow God is going to be satisfied with you. That's the point that the prophets make over and over again. And let's acknowledge that we daven 3 times a day for the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. And when the temple is rebuilt, the sacrificial system will be up and running again. And perhaps we will then come to some deeper understanding of what the religious significance of these rituals were. Want to wish everyone a good Shabbos.